We are now dangerously close to having a fully rigged character. As you can see, we've built the skeleton and added a basic rig, so all we need to do now is attach the model to it so it will deform and can be animated. And that's what we're going to do in this video. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention that you can now download all the source files for each part of this Rigging in Maya series so far. You can find a link in the description below. So now you can go back and follow along as we build this rig. Before we get into Maya's own tools, I have to admit that when it comes to painting weights, I don't really use them. Instead, I use a plugin called ngSkinTools. So why do I use it? Well, it just offers so much more than Maya's standard tools. It has useful features like layers, an enhanced mirroring workflow, and the smoothing algorithm is a lot sturdier and much more predictable than the one in Maya, as you will see in this video. You can also easily export and re-import the skin weights too, meaning rig revisions aren't a pain. Now, you can download this for free and there's a link in the description below. The free non-commercial version allows you to do pretty much everything, which is really cool, all apart from use the interactive mirroring options. What's even better is Victorus, the creator of ngSkinTools, has given me a few licenses to give away to you lucky people. So to be in with a chance of winning one, all you have to do is make sure you're subscribing to this channel and leave a comment below. What I will do is I will pick the winners at the end of the month. As good as ngSkinTools is, with this series I wanted to just stick with Maya. That's why we will focus purely on its native tools in this video. However, if you would like a tutorial on ngSkinTools itself, please let me know in the comments below and I will look into creating one for you. Let's get the model attached to the skeleton first, and this is an easy process. Simply select the root of the skeleton, so in this case it's a cog joint, add the model to the selection and go to Skin, Bind Skin and open the options. Just reset these settings. So there are a few options here to play around with. First, you choose what it is you want to bind to the skin. By default, this is set to joint hierarchy, which will use the selected joint and all the joints beneath it in the hierarchy, so you don't need to go in and select them all individually. Selected joints will only bind to the joints you have selected. Object hierarchy is useful if you have other elements in your rig, like locators or groups, which need to influence the model too. For game development rigs, this isn't used, as they need to be purely joint based, unless you're using blend shapes as well, obviously. Let's leave it at joint hierarchy so it will bind to the whole skeleton. And let's add those face elements too, so we attach the eyes and teeth geometry to the joints as well. So next we need to decide on our bind method. This tells Maya how to work out which joints influence which vertices. Closest distance basically uses the closest joint, regardless of where it is in the hierarchy. Closest hierarchy uses the actual joint hierarchy, so it searches for the parent or child of the current joint to use as influencers. Heat map generally gives better results, but it only works on joints which are actually inside the mesh. What it does is treats each joint like a heat source, emitting weight values onto the surrounding geometry. Geodesic voxels uses a more advanced method for working out the influences. Maya creates a voxel-based version of the mesh to help calculate the skin weights so it can be more precise. I don't tend to use this method, but it's more useful if you have a model with non-manifold geometry or intersecting polygons. Basically, if binding the skin with the other methods fails, this is a more stable option. Other options like normalized weights and weight distribution, I tend to leave at the default settings, especially for a basic model like this with a basic rig. Again, we will explore more of these when we come to look at more advanced rigging techniques. The only other option I'm going to change is to reduce max influence to 4. This just means that each vertex has a maximum of 4 joints influencing it. I'm reducing this because it will make the rig more efficient when it goes into a game engine. With that said, I'd always check with your team first to see what they prefer. Some may even want it to be less than 4 depending on the platform you're working on. So let's apply that. If we move the arm, you can see the model now follows. You can also see the area under the arm on the side of the torso is also moving with it. This is because we use the closest distance bind method, so the vertices which are closest to the humerus joint were attached to it. Let's undo that. And I'm going to switch to the FK arm, just so that I can manipulate the arm a little better. I'm going to change the bind method to closest in hierarchy and see if we get a different result. We're still getting an influence in this area, and for some strange reason it's affecting the thigh too. Maybe that's coming from the hand. Let's just undo that again and go back to closest distance. You can see the difference now. There's more of a gradual fall off here, whereas the influence was more linear with closest in hierarchy. Finally, let's try heat map. You'll notice that drop-off rate has now changed to heat map fall off, but for now we will leave it at 0.68. Let's also turn on wireframe so we can see the model a little clearer and apply that. As you can see, it takes a little longer to calculate. So as you can see now, the underneath of the arm isn't being influenced as much. If we try the head, that's moving quite nicely, not influencing the upper torso, which it might do with the other bind methods. The elbow doesn't look too bad either. Let's look at the fingers. This is usually a trouble spot when it comes to the default bind. They don't look too bad either. They need a bit of work, but it's a great starting point, and that's all we're looking at this point. It's just a good place for us to then go in and start manipulating the weight values. Let's look at the torso now. The hips look good, maybe a little too soft, but again a good starting point. Those spine joints look good too. The leg looks good, although it's affecting the hip. You can see how it creates this cavity, so we'll need to fix that. The foot roll looks good too, although the toes are possibly being influenced by the ankle joint too, but again that's easily fixed. So we have a really good starting point here, so let's dive in and start to edit those weights. Before I start painting the weight values, I like to pose the model, but prior to that I make sure I set a key in this bind pose. I'm just going to switch everything to FK for now. And select all the main controls on the left side. Make sure the time slider is set at 0. Switch to the animation menu set and go to Key Set Key. We now have a red mark down here to indicate the selected controls have a keyframe. I'm going to move to frame 1 now. What I'm also going to do is make sure Auto Keyframe is on. This will make sure that when I move the controls, a key will be applied automatically, so I don't need to manually set it each time. If I now pose the leg, a key is added on frame 1, so I can quickly get back to that initial bind pose whenever I like without losing this pose. I'm just going to pose some more areas of the rig, mainly in parts where there is a lot of deformation, like the shoulder and elbows. We will look at the fingers later. The pose is needed for checking how areas are deforming, and we do this because when we come to mirror the skin weights from the left side to the right, you often have to do it at the bind pose. As you will no doubt see later, there will be times when we mirror the weights and it fails in areas. Mayer's mirror tool doesn't really like posed rigs. On a side note, if you're using ngSkinTools, you don't need to do this because the mirror tools are so much better and more accurate. Before we look at painting weights, I want to quickly show you another option. Let's hide the main model and look at the eyes and mouth. If we move the look at control, actually I'm just going to disable auto keyframe for now. The eyes don't look like they are moving. Oh right, okay, so it would help if we actually bound them to the skeleton first. I'm just going to use the same values as before, which is a heat map. That's worked really well with the mouth. I don't think we need to change anything here. If I move the look at control, the eyes are moving but a small amount. This is likely due to them being influenced by the head and the eyelid joints too. There's a quick way to fix this without going into the Paint Skin Weights tool. Select the vertices on the left eye and go to Window, General Editors, Component Editor. If you make sure you're in the Smooth Skins tab, you can actually see each vertex and which joints are influencing it. You can also see the amount they're being influenced by. We only want the eye model to be influenced by the left eye joint, so select all the values beneath it and set those to 1. You will notice that the other influences have now gone. Let's update the right eye while we're here too. I'm going to disable X-ray joints so we can see the eyes a little clearer. If I move the control, the eyes follow perfectly, and the teeth are fine too. Time to go back to the main model. Yep, we definitely have some work to do on the head. So I'll just turn auto keyframe back on as we pose the rig. Time to look at editing the skin weight values on the body. I'll enable X-ray joints again because we need to see them as we work. Select the model and go to Skin, Paint Skin Weights and open the options. The first thing you will notice is the model changes colour. The white area represents the area the current joint is influencing, so in this case it's the cog joint. And here we have the main window. This is a list of all the current influences on the mesh, so basically all the joints. Oops, where did that go? If you scroll down to the Gradient tab, you have the option to use a colour map instead of the grayscale one. And this is probably the default option, so this may be what you see first before you go down and deselect it. Personally, I like the grayscale option, but then the colour option hasn't always been in Maya, so it's just what I've been used to. I'm not going to dwell too much on the other options in this video, simply because for what we are going to do, you don't need them. I will cover them in more detail in a future tutorial. As well as selecting which influence you want to work on in here, you can also right-click on the joints themselves and select the influence that way. You can also select the vertices which that joint is influencing too. This is good if you only want to paint on those and not accidentally paint outside that region. There are also options for displaying the local axis, display handle, and also lock the influence. Let's look at fixing this area here. So the little red circle is the brush we are using, and it's a little small at the moment. To increase the brush size, all you need to do is hold down B and then drag with your left mouse button. You can also change the radius in the window, but I find this much more intuitive and quicker. Now we have roughly the right brush size, I'm going to swap to a softer brush. This will allow me to adjust the influence gradually, so I have more control over where I paint. When it comes to painting, you have four main options: replace, add, smooth, and scale. I'm going to use add here because I want to build up the influence. Replace will just replace the influence with a specific value, so you're swapping it from one to another. I prefer add because it's more like painting, but the problem is you can only increase the value. The next important options are the opacity and value sliders. If I paint now, we are just going to get the maximum influence because both opacity and value are set to 1. This pulls the area out, but too much. The way you need to think about the opacity and value sliders is that value is the maximum value you want to paint, and opacity controls how much of that value you want to add with each stroke. So let's reduce the opacity. If I paint now, you will see I'm gradually working the area, which gives me much more control over the influence. Just reduce that a touch more. Doing this and using the softest brush means that the centre of the red circle will add the full amount, but the edges will add less. So again, I can use this to gradually work on the influence in this area to create a nice crease. Let's pose the right leg now so we can work on the full area. So just like before, we need to store this bind pose at frame 0. Select the FK controls and then set the time slider to 0. Pressing S to quickly add a keyframe. Move to frame 1 and now we can pose the leg. You can see here that the vertices are all over the place, whereas we need them to be aligned correctly. This is because they are being influenced by both thighs. Open the Paint Skin Weights tool again and make sure the cog is the influence you're working on. Using add again, this time we need to lock the crotch area to the cog. If you move your own legs, this area doesn't deform with them. Well, not much anyway, so we need to reflect this with the rig. And we can follow this all the way around the back. Initially, this doesn't look right, but you need to remember that it's the surrounding areas which are wrong. Now we have those adjusted, we need to soften the influence around it. So select Smooth this time as your paint operation and adjust the opacity to 1. We can now paint around the buttock area to soften that influence, giving us a much nicer deformation. This area on the hip is still recessed into the model, so switch back to Add. We need to also adjust the opacity again, and let's fill out that area. That looks better. Just smooth that area out a bit more. Looks like we need to add a bit more of an influence up here too. And smooth that into the chest. Another option with the brushes is to use the flood tool. This will apply the current paint operation and opacity to the whole model. So in this instance, it would smooth everything for me. This works in some areas, but not others, as you can see. So let's undo that. And let's just fix that rogue vertex as well. Let's move up to the next joint and select that as the influence we want to work on and smooth it manually. And then move up to the chest. We can fix this wing he's developed while we're here. So I'm just going to use add and reduce the opacity again. It would be nice if Maya remembered the settings for each paint operation so I didn't have to keep readjusting them. Take that around the back and remove the influence from the arm. And again, smooth the area out. I'm just going to raise the clavicle control now to see how this area deforms. Just select the clavicle joint. So we can see here that the clavicle is in fact influencing the abdomen area too, so that needs removing. This time I'm going to use replace as my painting operation, and if I set value to 0 this time and opacity to 1, so we're essentially painting a full value of 0, this will remove that influence. The surrounding area looks a little harsh, so let's soften that next. This time I'm going to use a slightly harder brush so I get more of the smooth influence. That's better. Let's move on to the humerus now and soften that too. So it looks like we have some more rogue weights. And this is one of the problems with Maya's tools, especially when you use smooth. Some weights can end up in areas you don't expect. Okay, I think we need a bit more of an influence on the shoulder, so we get more of a crease when it's raised. That's better. So let's just test that. You'll notice that I'm not raising the shoulder any higher than this. That's because we can't physically do that. Not with just the shoulder joint anyway. Once it reaches this level, the clavicle takes over to help raise the shoulder higher. It's good to keep these limitations in mind when you're painting weights so you don't cater for poses that aren't reachable. Let's have another look around. Just soften this a bit. Okay, so let's pose the right arm now, just as we did with the leg. We need to set a key at the bind pose on frame 0 and then we can pose it at frame 1. Remember to do the clavicle too. We can now clearly see the area we have corrected on his left and the default weights still on the right side. The good thing is we don't need to redo all that work to try and match it up. We can simply mirror the weights across. Go to Skin, Mirror Skin Weights and open the options. So first we need to dictate the direction we want to mirror in. So setting this to YZ will mirror across the Y and Z axes. What's handy is if we change this, Maya tells us below which way it will work. So we can see that it will work across the X axis and go from the positive side to the negative side. One thing to note is if you're mirroring between two separate models, this needs to be disabled. Below that we can choose how the weights are transferred using the model as a reference. Closest point on surface will try and match each side vertex to vertex, and because this model was mirrored, this would be the best option for us. Raycast uses a ray tracing algorithm to work out the weight values between the two sides, or models. Closest component finds the closest vertex or control vertex if you are using NURB surfaces and uses that value directly. If you're using a model with different topology on either side, I would suggest experimenting with all of these options to get the best results for your model. You can then choose how the joint hierarchy is used too, with the influence association drop-down boxes. Closest joint is again probably the best option as the skeleton was also mirrored, so it will match the closest joint on the right side. 1-to-1 is used on identical skeleton hierarchies, and label will use a predefined label, which you can set for each joint. As we don't have labels, this isn't useful for us. Let's just use the default values and see what we get. That looks good. And I do sound surprised for a reason. Traditionally, Maya doesn't do well with mirroring weights on a posed rig. This is why we needed to store the bind pose, so we could quickly go back and mirror the weights when we needed. This doesn't look too bad though. So there's a crease under the chest here, so let's soften that next. And again, I'm just working on the left side. And it looks like the abdomen joint is also influencing the upper chest, so we need to remove that too. Again, this is an issue with Maya's smoothing tool, something which ngSkinTools handles in a much better way. So that's done, and I'm just working on the left side, because remember we're just going to use the mirror tool to copy the weights across to the right side. This area in the abdomen looks too soft and needs a bit of a crease, so let's adjust that next. Let's change the cog influence to, and soften this area up here. That looks better, so let's mirror those weights. Let's move up to the elbow now, and the heat map did a good job here, but it's maybe a bit too harsh, and the elbow is a bit too angular. I'm going to select the humerus and pull some of the influence back towards it to close that gap. Maybe smoothing would be better. Okay, let's select the radius now and add more of an influence up here. We have the extra topology to play with, so we may as well use it. Let's move around and look at the inner elbow now. Maybe remove some of the influence here to fill this out and stop it collapsing as much. We'll just gently ease this area out too, again to stop it folding in on itself so much. It's a delicate balance in areas like this, especially with game models. You want to retain the form of the arm, but minimise the amount of intersection you will get. Okay, let's take a look at the head next. So the head moves around okay, and the neck, but there's an obvious issue with the jaw. Let's keep that open and select the head influence. As you can see, I initially thought the head was okay, but these grey areas tell me the head isn't fully following the head joint. I'm just going to use replace and set opacity and value to 1 and fix those areas around the face. And also the upper lip. Actually, I'm just going to switch to add, just so I can work with a bit more care in this area. We don't want the upper lip to be fully weighted to the head. Instead, we need a gradual curve down to the jaw. I'm going to switch to the jaw now and do the same. Just make sure these are fully weighted to it. With that done, I can now use smooth to go around and soften the lips. Let's now mirror that. And as you can see, this is one of those instances where Maya's mirror tool fails while the model is posed. So let's go back to frame 0 and the bind pose and try again. That looks like it's worked. Although we now have this vertex in the middle to fix. Nope, that's too much. The lower lip is too flat, so needs to have more of a curve in it. Let's see if we can soften that by adding some influence to the head joint. Oops, maybe reduce the opacity first. Okay, that's a little better. Let's just smooth that out too. And mirror those changes. And again, it's not worked. So let's try it with the bind pose. That's better and looks a bit more natural. Let's look at the rest of the head now and make sure it's weighted to the head joint. And maybe add a bit more of a crease here. Let's move to the neck and soften these. And maybe reduce its influence over the shoulder. And go back to the bind pose and mirror the weights. Let's have another look round the head. The neck does look too soft, so we might want to update that. Let's just add a bit more influence under here so it doesn't move in as much. That looks a bit strange now, so let's soften it back down a touch. And remove some of the jaw influence instead. There's a lot of experimenting when it comes to painting weights, trying to get the best deformation out of your model by adjusting the joint's influence over the vertices. Some things work and some things don't. We need to reset the jaw now so it's not posed on frame 0, which is the bind pose. Okay, so that's looking good so far. And at the moment, I'm just doing an initial first pass on these weights. I will probably come back and rework them later. For the purpose of the video, I don't want to spend hours on this. I just want to get across the basic process. Time to move on to the fingers. And like the rest of the body, we need to pose them first before we work on them. At the moment, they don't look too bad, but as we saw with the head, looks can be deceiving. Let's move this control so the metacarpal rotates too. Okay, let's work on the wrist first and fill this out a little. Tidy this up a bit and smooth it too. Like the shoulder, the wrist is a tricky area to get right on a basic rig like this, but we will talk more about that later. Onto the metacarpal now. Let's just soften the influence this has around the edges. I'll select the first finger joint now and see how that's looking. It looks like it's affecting the finger next to it, so I'm just going to use replace now to just remove that. And let's remove it from the next section of the finger. But first I'm going to reduce the size of the joints so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so we need each section of the finger to not be influenced by anything else, just at this stage anyway. I'll switch to the next joint now and remove its influence from the other sections. I'm going to leave the knuckle parts because we do need to blend between the two so we get a nice curve. Now we can look at the areas where the finger bends. Maybe just use smooth to soften these and get a better deformation. Yeah, that's better. Move to the next one and see how it looks. This could maybe use a few small adjustments too. Onto the main knuckle now, and we can bring that forward. Something like that. And soften the top here. Let's take a look at the thumb now. Again, we just need to soften this area a bit to make for a smoother deformation. Just bend this joint so we can see how it's looking. Just going to remove some of its influence from the base here. This area is collapsing in, so I need to bring that back out. Just going to make sure the end of the thumb is fully weighted to this joint and not the end joint. I need to tackle this sharp angle here. Let's try smoothing this. Okay, good, that's better. So that's the index finger and thumb done, or should I say the first pass done. I could spend more time on them, but you get the general idea of how we work on those. I'm going to reset the index finger now and move on to the middle finger. Just as before, we need to pose it first so we see how it deforms. I'll reset the thumb too. The process is exactly the same. We need the bulk of each section of the finger to be fully weighted to its joint. Once that's done, you can go in and soften the areas where they bend. Because we're just repeating the same process now for each finger, I'll speed up the video so it's not boring for you to watch. There is another way you can work on the fingers, and that's to use the vertices directly. Select the vertices of the top of the pinky and then open the Paint Skin Weights tool. Select the pinky 3 joint as the influence. Because you've selected the vertices, they will be the only parts of the finger that will be affected as you paint. So if you use replace as the painting operation and set opacity and value to 1, you can quickly flood the end of the finger, rather than painting it. We can now move up to the next section. Select the vertices, the correct joint influence, and flood those. And repeat that for the next section too. That was quicker and has given us some clean weights to work with. Now all we need to do is go in and soften the bends and creases. We also need to work on the metacarpal area too, to soften that and fill out the palm. Okay, that looks good for now. Right, let's move on to the leg. We already adjusted the hip area, so let's look at the knee. The topology here doesn't look good. It's not neat enough as it deforms. Let's try smoothing it and see if that helps clean it up and also soften the bend. We've maybe gone too far on the inside of the thigh, so let's fill that back out again. So we have this nasty angle on the ankle here, so let's just soften that too. Okay, that's better. I can see that the toes aren't fully weighted to the ball joint. The big toe is slightly grey. I'll just correct those now so they follow the joint fully as the toe bends. We also need to remove the influence from the rest of the foot. Maybe just soften this too. Oops. Okay, doesn't like that. Let's try another approach. I'll switch to add instead and just increase the foot influence ever so slightly here. Okay, good. That bends nicely. Let's just reset the pose and mirror the weights to copy everything we've done across to the right side. And give that a quick test. Okay, looks good. I'll also check the finger weights mirrored across correctly too. Okay, they look okay. The palm needs a tweak, but I can come back to that. So at this stage the main body is done. or done enough for this section of the video. So let's go back to the head now. I want to see how the eyes are working because we still need to work on the eyelids. I'm going to reset the pose for now so we can just focus on the eyelids. And I'm going to move the upper eyelid down so we can see the model move as we paint the weights. So I have some basic weights here to show the current influence, and if I move the control you can see the eyelid moving. I'm just going to isolate the main model for now because we will need to work on the eyelid from all directions, even from looking inside the head, so I don't want the eye geometry in there. We want the inner part of the eyelid to be fully weighted to the eyelid joint, so it needs to be white. This will give us a good idea of how far the eyelid is moving when the control moves. There's a good possibility we need to adjust the rig so it moves the correct amount. So I know I moved the control down quite a bit, so the eyelid obviously needs to move further than this. Select the eyelid control and open the left eyelid upper multi-node in the channel box. If you remember in the previous video we added these values, the 250 and minus 250, to act as a multiplier for the control's movement. We now know these need to be increased so the eyelid moves more. Let's change that to minus 500 instead. That's better, but it needs to move more. How about minus 750? Okay. Let's adjust the control so it's moved down to about halfway. About there should do. Okay, let's change this again to minus 1000. That looks better. The eyelid control is now halfway down, and so is the eyelid geometry. So let's update the other values too. And repeat that for the lower eyelid control, updating the values to 1000. Now we can work more on the eyelid weights, but first lower the control to close the eye. I realise that naturally your lower eyelid raises a bit too when you blink, but we are just working on the upper one for now. We can now go in and smooth out the eyelid weights so they are distributed a bit more evenly across the surface. What we can also do is try and adjust these values so the eyelid closes properly too. Something like that. Let's move the lower eyelid up this time and start to add the influence in for that. Get rid of that. So just like the upper lid, we want these inner polygons to be fully weighted to the lower eyelid joint. These corners can just have a small influence for now. As you can see, we have random influences all over the body, so we need to remove these. If you find you have these smaller influences on your model, you can always try to prune them. Navigate to the Skin menu and work your way down to Prune Small Weights and open the options. This will go through the model and remove any influences below your set value. So in this instance, it's 0.01. And then it redistributes them to stronger nearby influences. Let's see if that's cleaned it up. If not, we might need to increase the value. But the problem then is we run the risk of affecting other areas and removing weights that we've already painted. So they're still there, so pruning them maybe didn't work. So let's just go in and remove them manually. As a general rule though, you should use the Prune Small Weights tool when you're working on skinning a model to ensure those small weights are removed. They can be expensive if you're working on a game model. Let's move that up a bit to close the eye. Maybe a bit more. And like we did with the upper eyelid, smooth it to redistribute the topology. Also adjust from the inside to get a better fit. Okay, so let's reset those and turn off X-ray joints and disable the wireframe so we can see how these look. Upper eyelid looks good. And the lower one looks good too. We can also widen the eyes too if we want. Now, the test will be if Maya will let us mirror the weights. If you remember, we move the eyelid joints away from the actual eye joint. So this should prevent the weights being transferred onto the wrong joints. Okay, that looks like it's worked, although we do need to update the values. So change that to 1000 and those to -1000. And do the lower eyelid too. Okay, they work. Great. If we move the look at control, the eyelids should follow the eyes too. Looks a bit weird, but I know what's causing that. Let's reduce the amount the eyelids follow the eyes first, maybe 0.15. That looks better, but I think the issue is that the eyelids are tilting too, so they're rotating around the Z-axis. We can easily change this by reducing the number in the multiply divide node. Let's just try 0.1. Yep, that works too. So let's just take a step back now and have a quick look at removing that twist we have on the eyelids. So it's quite an easy fix. All you need to do is select the eyelid joint, open up the multiply divide node and set the input to Z to 0. So that's just going to remove the influence that we have on it, which is in turn going to remove the twist. There we go, that's better. That twist is removed, and now when the eyes move and the eyelids move, it looks a lot more natural. Right, this is looking good. So we've gone through and painted all the ways, and this guy is ready to be animated. Obviously, I've kind of rushed through these, and there are some areas that need tweaking, but I hope you've got the general idea behind my workflow. You also have to remember that this is a game model, so some areas aren't going to look as smooth as they would be if this was a high resolution model. But all the processes that I've gone through and discussed in this video so far can easily be used on a high resolution model or a subdivision surfaces model. I'll just switch IK back on. So we can move him around now, and we can wiggle his hips, and the model follows. So there's a bit that needs adjusting. So after all these videos, you now have a fully rigged character. But with this being a basic rig, it does have its disadvantages. One of the big issues with it are the lack of any roll joints. If we look at the shoulder, it will happily rotate around the Z and X axes. But when you rotate around the Y, so when the arm twists, you get this unnatural deformation around the shoulder. If you look at your own arm as it twists, you will see that the shoulder doesn't rotate that way. Instead, the arm twists around the bicep. We have the same issue at the wrist. The rotations are fine, but when it comes to the twist, the wrist breaks. Again, if you rotate your own wrist, you will see that when it twists, it's actually the forearm that deforms and twists, not the wrist. This even happens with the thigh. Again, we get an unnatural twist, and it could be applied to the ankle area too. So what we have to do is add what's known as roll joints to help facilitate these rotations and make the arm and leg deform in a much more natural way. And this is what we're going to do in the next video. For now though, you have a nice rig that's ready to go. I'd spend some more time checking how it deforms and adjusting the weights. Like here under the arm. Now it's twisting, we can see it needs some more work. We can even use the fist attribute you added earlier to quickly pose the hand. Although now the fingers are skinned, we can see that it needs adjusting. Remember, you can do this easily in the graph editor as demonstrated previously. Even the foot controls look good. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, please let me know in the comments below. I always appreciate feedback. Also let me know if you have any questions, and also tell me what future videos you would like to see. Remember that the source files for all the videos so far are now available to download, so you can get those from the links in the description, download them, and then you can follow along with each step as we build this rig. As always, remember to like this tutorial and subscribe to my channel to keep up to date with future videos. This is antCGi signing off, and I will see you on the next one.